A historic shift is in progress as the European Union is preparing to unleash an unprecedented military revival. Reports indicate that a massive new defense package is being prepared, one that's aimed at both bolstering Ukraine and fortifying Europe against the expansionist ambitions of Russian President Vladimir Putin. With tensions rising and questions looming over U.S. support, this initiative could completely reshape the balance of power and lead to Europe being capable of defending itself against Russia with or without the United States. This new defense package is a game-changer. Here's what you need to know. On February 17th, reports surfaced that French President Emmanuel Macron was inviting key European leaders to urgent talks in Paris. Those emergency discussions come in response to a stark warning from the United States. There's a limit on how much America is prepared to do for Europe. With growing concerns over security and shifting geopolitical alliances, the stakes have never been higher. U.S. President Donald Trump's return has signaled a shift in European defense. For over 80 years, Europe has relied heavily on U.S. military support. A long-standing point of contention for Trump, who argues that America is footing too much of the bill. Now with Washington signaling a tougher stance, European leaders are facing a stark reality. It's time to take defense into their own hands. During the Munich Security Conference, the discussion centered on what Europe could do to make itself less reliant on American support. The overall consensus was that the United States was no longer going to foot the bill for NATO security, claimed Republican Congressman Michael McCaul in the wake of the conference. Our European allies recognize that it's time for them to step up to the plate in their own backyard. Stepping up to the plate means reviving Europe's collective militaries. It also means ramping up support for Ukraine as it continues to resist Putin's invasion. So, how does Europe plan to do that? By moving forward with what could become the largest defense package in the continent's history. An unprecedented effort that would strengthen its military capabilities and secure its future. Reports have indicated that the European officials who will meet in Paris are secretly working on creating a massive €700 billion aid package, or around $730 billion, all of which Europe intends to dedicate to collective defense. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock offered the first hints about the incoming package. Speaking to reporters during the Munich Security Conference, she said the package has never been seen in this dimension before. It's a staggering sum. That $700+ billion number was first reported by the German newspaper Berliner Zeitung, which cited German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock as suggesting the number. Baerbock compared the plan to past financial rescue efforts, stating, "Similar to the Eurozone and the Corona crisis, there is now a financial package for security in Europe that will come in the near future." Baerbock is referring to the €672.5 billion recovery fund established after the COVID-19 pandemic, an initiative designed to stabilize Europe's economy over 6 years. But this time, the focus isn't on economic recovery, it's military recovery. Lithuanian Defense Minister Dovilė Šakalienė was among the first to laud the package, stating that Europe has reached the realization that it's not the US which will defend Europe, but Europe defending ourselves with help from the US. Šakalienė added, "We need to spend on defense fast, and a lot. Hundreds of billions need to be spent immediately. We will all have to move fast, Germany included." But there's a problem. As is so often the case in the European Union, bureaucracy is slowing progress. With Germany's regional elections approaching on February 23rd, officials are hesitant to make any major defense commitments that could spark political controversy. Instead, leaders are expected to hold off on formal announcements until after the dust has settled and the votes are counted. Still, Baerbock underscores the urgency, pointing out that peace in Europe can only be achieved if all of the anti-Russia countries on the continent pull together. She added, "As Europeans and as Germans, we stand firmly with Ukraine, militarily, humanitarily, and financially. Since Russia's full-scale invasion, we Europeans have provided over $140.16 billion in aid to Ukraine, with Germany contributing nearly $46 billion. Those are impressive figures, and that's exactly why leaders are now pushing forward with a historic defense plan, one that could reshape the future of European security. After all, Europe has already dedicated well over $100 billion to supporting Ukraine, as Baerbock pointed out. So why is it now looking to spend more than 5 times that amount on collective defense after 3 years of the Ukraine war? There are several answers to that question, with the first involving the man who launched the special military operation in February 2022, Vladimir Putin. Many on the continent are worried that victory in Ukraine won't signal the end of Putin's expansionist goals. If anything, that would just be the start. If Putin wins in Ukraine, he might set his sights on the rest of Europe, especially if he believes NATO has weakened. That's according to the Danish Defense Intelligence Service, or DDIS, which says Russia would be ready to wage a large-scale war against Europe within 5 years. Russia's likely to be more willing to use military force in a regional war against one or more European NATO countries if it perceives NATO as militarily weakened or politically divided, says the DDIS. This is particularly true if Russia assesses that the US cannot or will not support the European NATO countries in a war with Russia. The American support issue is a major hurdle, and we'll be returning to that issue soon. The more pressing problem is that if Putin is ready to wage war in Europe, the EU needs to be ready, and frankly, it isn't. That's according to Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal writing for Politico on February 14th. He said that Russia has already unleashed a war against the EU. Granted, that war doesn't involve tanks rolling through the streets or air sirens blaring daily. It's instead a hybrid war in which Putin's regime has been looking for cracks in the European house, and when he finds them, he pours boiling water in them or tries to pry them open with a crowbar, says Shmyhal. Destroying underseas internet cables, sending drones over European air bases, creating migration pressure on the Polish and Lithuanian borders, these are all signs that Putin is already at war with Europe in a non-conventional sense. They are also signs that Putin is setting the stage for future aggression, according to Shmyhal. Putin is putting pressure on Europe even as his forces fight in Ukraine, and Europe may not be ready to fend him off if he makes his war continent-wide. On the surface, that doesn't seem like it should be the case. Excluding the United States, European NATO would still be able to bring 1.5 million troops to a fight against Russia. That stacks up well against the 1.32 million active personnel in Putin's military. Europe also has access to more technologically advanced instruments of war. Russia has been forced to rely on Soviet-era tanks and artillery to sustain its bombardments in Ukraine. Advanced Western weapons, in addition to Ukraine's ever-growing drone stockpiles, have helped to push Putin back. Those advanced weapons would come to the fore in a war between Europe and Russia. NATO also excels in conducting combined arms operations that see air forces, navies, and ground troops cooperating to achieve a shared goal. That's something Russia has shown itself incapable of doing, as the destruction of over a third of the Black Sea Fleet and Putin's reliance on human wave assaults demonstrates. However, matching or exceeding Russia's manpower and equipment capabilities alone won't be enough to defeat Putin. European NATO heavily relies on the US for some of its key capabilities. Operational intelligence is typically provided by America. The US also has the largest fleet of aerial tankers in the world, which enable air-to-air refueling. Plus, it plays a key part in Europe's missile defense strategy, and without the US to match Russia's nuclear weapon stockpiles, Europe brings only 515 nukes to the table to compete with Russia's 5,580. Europe still has a ways to go to prepare itself for a war with Russia. A substantial portion of the proposed $700 billion defense package is expected to go towards strengthening key military capabilities that would be critical if the United States were no longer in the fight. But this package is actually about more than just bolstering Europe's defenses. It's also a direct response to a growing reality. Europe can no longer count on the US as its ultimate safeguard. At the Munich Security Conference, leaders grappled with a pressing question: how will Europe secure itself without guaranteed American support? And while some may believe Washington would never turn its back on European defense, the facts tell a different story. The reality, US support is no longer a certainty. Two key factors are driving that shift: the financial burden on Washington and what appears to be a dramatic shift in US policy toward Russia. For years, President Donald Trump has made claims that NATO's European members aren't paying their fair share for defense. His criticisms date back to 2017, when only 5 of NATO's 28 members met the alliance's 2% GDP defense spending target. A stark contrast to the United States, which covered 22% of NATO's total costs, according to the New York Times. Since then, much has changed. NATO is larger, with its membership growing to 32 countries since 2017. More of those countries are hitting or exceeding the 2% target too. 23 of the 32 hit the 2% target in 2024, but that may not be enough for Trump. Michael McCall hinted at that with his comments about how it was time for Europe to step up to the plate. And if there was any doubt that money was still on Trump's mind, those doubts were dispelled in February when Trump made some interesting claims about military aid to Ukraine. Well, we gave them, I believe, $350 billion. But let's say it's something less than that, but it's a lot, and we have to equalize with Europe because Europe has given a very much smaller percentage than that, Trump claimed. I think Europe has given $100 billion, and we've given, let's say, $300 billion plus. And it's more important for them than it is for us. We have an ocean in between, and they don't. Those numbers aren't strictly accurate, at least according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy's Ukraine Support Tracker. It says that the U.S. has allocated about $119 billion in aid to Ukraine. Collectively, Europe has allocated even more than that, $137.94 billion, with another $120 billion to be allocated in the future. Assuming that the tracker is correct, Europe has more than doubled America's military aid outlay for the Ukraine war when combining allocated and yet to be allocated funds. Yet for Trump, perception always outweighs reality. He insists the US is paying more than its fair share, and he has repeatedly floated the idea of the US leaving NATO over defense spending concerns. Even as more European nations meet the 2% obligation, America's president seems to be moving the goalposts. He now believes that NATO members should be spending 5% of their GDP on defense, claiming that they can all afford it. It's possible Trump is using that figure to give him an excuse to pull the US out of NATO if its European members don't hit his new 5% target. That's despite the fact that the US doesn't spend that much. It's dedicated 3.38% of its GDP to defense in 2024. Europe is worried about Trump and all his money-related rhetoric. Even if the figures Trump delivers aren't accurate, the fact that he believes them to be so is enough. To Europe, it looks like Trump is looking for a way to escape America's NATO obligations. If he's successful, that would mean no US support if Europe went to war with Russia. The $700 billion defense package is likely a direct response to that possibility. Europe's concerns about the US support aren't solely money-related, though. Also concerning to Europe is what appears to be a complete turnaround in America's approach to the Ukraine war. The turnaround seemed to start earlier in February when Trump held initial talks with Putin in Saudi Arabia about how to bring an end to his special military operation. There was a key issue with those talks: Ukraine wasn't invited. In the wake of his meeting with Putin, Trump has become extremely critical of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He claimed to be very disappointed to hear that Ukraine was upset about not having a seat at the table for his talks with Putin. "Today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited." "Well, you've been there for 3 years," Trump exclaimed. "You should have never started it. You could have made a deal," Trump added. These comments appear to show Trump repositioning Ukraine as the aggressor in its conflict with Russia. America's president didn't stop there. In a post on Truth Social, Trump decried Zelensky as a modestly successful comedian who managed to talk the United States into spending $350 billion on a war Ukraine could never win without the US. The only thing Zelensky was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle, Trump claimed before adding a jibe that sent shockwaves through Europe. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. To Trump, it appears that Putin is no longer the war-waging dictator of the Ukraine war. That title goes to Zelensky. He went on to claim that Zelensky had done a terrible job shattering his country and causing millions of unnecessary deaths. There are now also rumors circulating that Trump is considering pulling American troops out of the Baltic states. That's according to America's ambassador to NATO, Julie Smith, who believes Trump may agree to Putin's demands to withdraw 20,000 US soldiers sent to Europe by Joe Biden in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Worse yet, that withdrawal could have knock-on effects. Britain, France, and Germany all have battle groups on Europe's eastern flank that they may be forced to withdraw if the American troops disappear. There's also a possibility that Trump will pull the 30,000-plus troops stationed in Germany. The lights are blinking red, warned Smith, and Europe is paying attention. Combine Putin's ambitions for Europe, the potential for America's withdrawal of funds and troops, and Trump seemingly supporting Putin ahead of Zelensky in recent days, and you get a powder keg waiting to explode. Europe doesn't believe that it can rely on the US anymore. With all of his rhetoric, Trump is reinforcing that belief. So, the $700 billion defense package isn't just an investment, it's a strategic necessity. With US support for European security increasingly uncertain, Europe is taking matters into its own hands, preparing for a future where it may have to stand against Russia without Washington's backing. While no official announcement has been made, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has outlined key priorities for how the $700 billion be spent. He says that military training will be a priority, likely involving continuing efforts in Ukraine along with training for European troops to prepare them for the possibility of war against Putin's forces. In November 2024, the EU extended its commitment to its military training mission in Ukraine by 2 years. It's likely that more money will be poured into that mission, with the EU also now seeing it as a chance to train troops on how to cooperate with Ukraine's forces should they ever need to fight together against Russia directly. Some of the $700 billion may go toward further extending this training mission and perhaps providing more European troops in Ukraine. We may also see an expansion of the EU's Common Security and Defense Policy, or CSDP. Under the CSDP, the EU deploys around 3,500 military personnel and 1,300 civilians around the world. Those people are currently working across 21 missions and operations, including 8 military operations, 12 civilian-led initiatives, and 1 mission involving both civilians and military personnel. It's likely the CSDP will expand its scope with help from the $700 billion cash injection. That could mean more military operations in the future, allowing the EU to project power without America's help, along with more support for CSDP's ongoing operations. Another possibility now gaining traction is the formation of a European army. It's telling that Macron has invited some of Europe's major leaders to a secret conference in the wake of a $700 billion defense announcement. Back in May 2024, Macron was the first EU leader to claim he would consider sending troops to Ukraine if Russia broke through in the country. He's since walked those comments back, ruling out the possibility as recently as February 19th. Macron's comments also met with condemnation from many in Europe that felt he was needlessly escalating the conflict with Putin. However, even with his claims that France isn't considering sending French combat troops to Ukraine, it's clear that building a defense against Russia is on Macron's mind. What the defense might look like is the key question. Matthew Seville, who is the Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute think tank, believes that Europe may create a large land deterrence force if it went down the European army route. That force would need to include somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 troops to be strong enough to respond to Putin's aggression. That's around the range of troops Zelensky believes he needs to sustain Ukraine's defense. It's also possible that Europe could create a smaller tripwire force of several tens of thousands of soldiers operating in Ukraine after a ceasefire is announced in Putin's war. Any attempt by Putin to reinvade after the war would trip the wire, pushing Europe into a direct conflict with Russia. While these are all still just suggestions and Europe hasn't committed to building any sort of united European army, it's possible that some of the $700 billion is being earmarked for laying the foundations of a future where that army is needed. More likely and more directly helpful to Ukraine out of all of these options is that most of the money will be dedicated to accelerating European aid efforts and arms deliveries to Kyiv. The US may be helpful in that arena. On February 13th, America committed to speeding up weapons shipments to Europe by eliminating much of the red tape that slows these shipments down. This commitment came before Trump's comments indicating that he's changed his opinion on Zelensky and the Ukraine war. However, if the United States maintains that commitment, we'll likely see where much of the $700 billion will go. Europe will buy from the US, it'll then send those purchased weapons to Ukraine to aid in its defense. That could also be enough to assuage Trump's money worries. After all, a large portion of $700 billion being pumped into the American economy would be great news for Trump. He'd see that Europe is committed to paying its way, which might lead him to conclude that supporting the continent in the fight against Putin isn't such a bad idea. All of this remains to be seen. For now, we know that Europe has transformed itself with its $700 billion plus pledge in its defense. It's gearing up for a war along with increasing its support of Ukraine at a time when the continent's alliance with the US is on shaky ground. We want to know what you think, though. Will this massive cash injection be enough to stop Putin? Tell us in the comments and make sure to subscribe for the latest news about European defense and ongoing conflict and military news from around the world. We're a truly independent source striving to bring you the best, most accurate, and up-to-date information possible, and we sincerely appreciate your support.